All right, welcome back to CHRTC 309. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at our third part of our discussion on the nuns, digging into what they actually believe. All right, so according to the data from Thiessen and Laflamme, about 64%, right? So 2/3 of US nuns believe in God or a universal spirit, right? So this is still a big chunk, right? This is kind of interesting. Maybe a little bit of a contradiction, but it suggests that, what we sometimes think of as the nuns, right? That growth of people who are atheists is probably not correct, right? They believe in something, or maybe it's a holdover belief from, previous religion or a kind of cultural belief in God, but it still appears to be there, at least in the US. A third of US nuns say they don't believe in God or a universal spirit, so, still a pretty vast minority. Definitely a sizable minority, but not the vast majority by any stretch. Only 13% say they are atheists, right? So what we're seeing in the growth of the nuns is definitely not a growth of atheism. It is a growth of atheism, but it's not a complete growth of atheism, right? It's something different. It's an entirely different phenomenon from atheism. 52% of them say, so over half, right? They believe in life after death. A sizable minority at 41% say they believe in heaven. And less than a third say they believe in hell. And this is always actually an interesting one for me. I'm puzzled by, what it is they believe life after death is. In terms of, like, I don't have a good insight into, outside of heaven and hell, what they think life after death looks like. And I think this is something that definitely bears a lot more research, and something I'd be really interested in kind of hearing about if anyone knows where we can find the insight here. Yeah, so that said, 3/4 of US nuns believe the Bible was written by men rather than having a divine origin, right? So that it is just a book, essentially, which, in a sense, somewhat parallels the traditional Christian teaching as well, in that, Christians will treat it as divinely inspired, but written by people. So, I'm not, I'm a little curious about this number, in the sense that I wonder if there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what people think Christians mean when they say the Bible is divinely inspired. But that's, neither here nor there, really. 3/4 don't think the Bible is from a divine origin at all, that it's just a human-made text. Now, unfortunately, and this is true of a lot of Canadian social science research, the Canadian data that we have is really low quality, right? Whereas the US has had these, long-standing things like the General Social Survey that have been running since the 1970s, that have been asking questions. You have things like the Congressional or the Cooperative Election Study out of Harvard, right? You have a whole bunch of, you have things like the National Study of Youth and Religion. You have a wealth of really interesting social science data that comes out of the United States. In Canada, we have not been as diligent about this, and especially on questions of religion, it's something that sort of the Canadian social science establishment has just not been as deeply interested in, right? Which is why, like, someone like Joel Thiessen, who's great, and I know Joel personally. We've met a couple of times. Like, we're not friends, but we've certainly met each other, and I think we're friendly-ish. Joel is one of the best sociologists of religion in Canada, probably the best. And he works at a fairly unimposing school called Ambrose University that has, I think, about 600 students in Calgary. Now, maybe this is by choice. I don't know. I've never asked. He could probably go anywhere he wanted, but he's at Ambrose. And this, I think, suggests that sociology of religion is just not a prominent or particularly important field in Canada. And as a result, our data is really pretty terrible. The data that Thiessen and Laflamme cite in their book comes from this Angus Reid poll of 657 religious nun respondents which they admit is a non-representative sample, right? This is not enough people to constitute a nationally representative sample. It is way, way too small. And so we need someone with deep pockets, I think, to fund some proper research in this sphere. 72% of those polled in this Angus Reid poll, and again, it's not representative, so we can't take too much away from it. But about 3/4 say they don't believe in God or a universal spirit, and 2/3 or a little more say they don't believe at all in life after death, right? So it's like, poof, you're gone, blackness envelops you, and it's no different than before you were born, I guess. You didn't exist, and you will not exist again. Reg Bibi, who's probably the most famous sociologist of religion in Canada of the last, 30 years, who was, I think he's retired now, but he was based out of University of Lethbridge, basically said Canadians have 3 categories, right? Either they embrace religion, they reject religion, or they have a sort of middle indifference to religion. And in our Angus Reid poll, the nuns are overwhelmingly in that reject religion category. Some interesting kind of things on what they do believe, though, and I will kind of dig into the data here a little bit. So of the religiously affiliated, 30% believe in extraterrestrials, is almost half of the nuns. Reincarnation, right? So, almost 40% of the religiously affiliated. I want to see these questions that they ask, because that's a weird number to me, because if we're talking about a country that's predominantly Christian, reincarnation is not a Christian belief. But people get stuff wrong, so I'd just be curious as to how this question was asked. But 1/3 of our nothing in particulars, right, no religious affiliation, believe in reincarnation. So that's a spiritual belief. Not surprisingly, our religiously affiliated, almost 3/4 believe in miracles. But then, 40%, substantial minority of our nuns believe in miracles. So what is going on here? This is a hard number, I think, to parse. It's like, this is some kind of spiritual belief, I think, right? Where do miracles come from? This is always the question. It's like, where do these 40% of people think miracles come from? If in that data, like 74% of them don't believe in God or a universal spirit. So where do miracles come from for this 42%? This is why the nuns are always a lot of fun to think about, because it's like, where are they getting their beliefs? Like, what is actually going on here? I really don't understand. It's like, okay, so a solid 3/4 of you don't believe that there's any God or universal spirit, but then a solid 42% believe in miracles. But where would those miracles come from? I can, say that I'm genuinely perplexed by this kind of data. And this comes up when we talk about the nuns all over the place, right? Just an absolute hodgepodge of beliefs. Belief in hell, right? About 1/5 of our nothings in particular, and about half of our religiously affiliated, which again, that one surprises me a little, but let's not dig into that too much. Belief in heaven, right? Everybody's a little bit warmer on heaven than they are on hell. I guess so that makes sense. More than 3/4 of the religiously affiliated, and about 1/3 of our non-affiliated sample believe in heaven. Again, if they don't believe in God or a universal spirit, what does this heaven look like? From whence does it come? I have no idea, and I literally just cannot wrap my head around where this belief comes from. Life on Earth is purely physical or biological phenomenon, better than 1/3. And again, if you don't believe in a universal spirit or God, I don't know what the alternative to a physical and biological phenomenon is. So I'm perplexed about I'm perplexed about the rest of the sample that we don't see here, but that's just me. Believe we are all part of a mysterious and inexplicable force, right? The religiously affiliated are cool to this, but about 1/3 of the unaffiliated are warm to it, right? So that's interesting. Belief in God, but in my own way, about half of the affiliated people say that, which is interesting, right? So they're just, in a sense, you can see even in that religiously affiliated part of the sample, a bit of a deinstitutionalization, right? Like, not necessarily what what they're being taught in church. They're coming up with it on their own. And 30% of our unaffiliated people. Belief in God as taught by the church, it's 2% for the unaffiliated, not surprising. But then, it's only 35% for the affiliated, which is a weird thing. And this, I think speaks to the poor quality of the data as well. Like, some of this just potentially doesn't make sense. It's the best data we have, but I look forward to Joel and Sarah kind of maybe getting some better data and showing us something that makes a little more sense than this. So, what we have here, some kind of different questions that are looked at in Joel and Sarah's book. The importance of religion and spirituality in everyday life in Canada and in the US. Right, what we see obviously are religiously affiliated folks, right? We're looking at 75% in Canada say it's either important or somewhat important, right? And 40% in Canada saying it's very important, right? So that's a pretty solid number. 35% saying it is somewhat important, right? So that's pretty good. Small portions of the sample saying it's not important at all. When we look at the, in Canada, no religious affiliation, it's like 67% saying that it is completely unimportant, right? Or not very important, or not at all important for the religiously unaffiliated, right? And small percentages saying that it is important. In the US, kind of a similar story. It's only about 33% of the no religious affiliation, so a third that say religion and spirituality is important in their everyday life. And then, a solid, 67%, so 2/3 again, saying it's not important. Please forgive my on-the-job kind of math doing skills. And same with the religiously affiliated, right? In the U.S., a smaller percentage say they strongly agree that it's important. But then, the total sample is, 76% say it's either that they either strongly agree or just agree that religion or spirituality is important in their everyday life, right? So, we have a clear difference, right? The bulk of the nuns, religion and spirituality is just not important. And that tells us something too, right? It's sort of a meh. It's kind of meh for them. They're not that interested in the question in a lot of ways, right? Maybe it's just not interesting to them. All right, so nothing too surprising on this slide, right? So what do we see, right? With regard to the nuns, right, are nothing in particulars. The vast majority of them, have no religious or spiritual practices on their own, right? So 82% say not at all. 87% say not at all or a few times a year, right? And then only 12% are saying that, at least once a week or at least once a month, right? Very small part of the sample. So they're just not engaging in any religious or spiritual practices. Not surprising, frequency of religious service attendance, 81% say not at all. If you add, a few times a year, and the way this looks like it's asked, it would not exclude weddings or funerals, so you could probably cluster that in there, which skews the sample a bit, right? But nevertheless, so we're talking 98% of them is a few times a year or not at all, right? I think I got that 98%. So are at least once a week and at least once a month sample are 1% each. So really unsubstantial. So they're not practicing, for the most part, anything spiritual or religious on their own, and they're not attending religious services at all. Okay, the one practice that does seem to have a little bit of traction amongst this group is meditation, right? What do we got here? At least once a day or at least once a week, showing up at about a third, right? And if you add a few times a month, right, you're talking, I guess a solid 41%, right? But then the vast majority is still never doing it. Very few of them read religious texts outside of religious services, right? Although 9% say they do it once a day, which is, again, kind of interesting. Unexpected, or at least once a month. We're talking 15%. Not a big amount, but, the vast majority, 70, 9% are doing it either never or seldom. So, that again tells us something. Frequency of participating in prayer, 25% not never. And add to that, another, so 89%. It's seldom or never. So, I mean, that again, not a very big amount. Religious service attendance, never, 40%. Add another seldom, 32%. You got 72% of your sample. A few times a year, again, the way this looks like it's asked, it wouldn't exclude weddings and funerals. So, we've really only got 9%, it's like, that ever go in our kind of sample of nuns. Prayer outside of religious services. This one's a little bit more interesting. I think there's a little bit more nuance here. Again, like the vast majority are just not doing it, right? You're talking about it's like 62%, seldom or never, right? Which is lower than these other categories. So that's, again, something interesting. A few times a month, to at least once a week. So that's what, 39%, so, and 20% saying they do it every day, which again is just unbelievably confusing to me. What is going on with these 20%, right? Right? What are they praying to? It's so unclear, and I really wish, I would love to spend like a year just interviewing nuns, and digging into their sense of this, right? This is great quantitative work. Oh God, it requires a ton of qualitative work to figure out what the heck is going on. Because yeah, that 20% is confounding. They're praying at least once a day. So who are they? Why are they nuns? I don't know, but it doesn't inherently make that much sense to me. Yeah, so despite the fact that, a lot of religious people, if you listen to the sort of apologetics on the nuns, there's this sort of, I think, kind of broad consensus that, having no religious beliefs at all probably cascades into a sort of nihilism eventually. A sort of self-destruction and a belief that there's no point in living in the world, right? Nietzsche was sort of affected by this, right? A sense that, either we'd have to make our own meaning, or in the lack of meaning, we should all just commit self-slaughter. That's sort of, in a lot of cases, the religious view. But according to this Angus Reid poll, again, the data is not super good quality, but it's worth talking about. Among those who reject religion, right? So there are religious rejectors. They're most likely to attribute things that happen in their life to either their own effort. So when things go right, it's because of them. When things go bad, it's because of them. Chance, so 93% say it's their own effort. Again, these are select all that apply kind of questions. Chance, just luck or a random coincidence, about half. About a third put it down to luck, and about 8% put it down to God. One of the things you see, right, and I've noticed this in kind of interactions with people who consider themselves nothing in particular. There do seem to be these sort of lingering quasi-religious beliefs, all right? Things like everything happens for a reason. So, I mean, in the interview data, and I will say that Laflamme and Thiessen don't have great interview data in their book, right? There's not enough of them, and they're too clustered in a single location, which is Calgary, where Joel is. And so I don't love that part of their data. I think the qualitative side of the book is quite weak. But from what they do find in their interview data, statements like everything happens for a reason does tend to show up a lot. Okay. What does this mean, right? I mean, this is at best, a very interesting statement, right? Everything happens for a reason, tends to come through this interview data. Okay, what reason, right? Why this should be the case? What is directing this reason, to me, has always been unclear, right? And I mean, I noticed this, like, I'll tell a story. I had a close friend of mine a few years ago who passed away, and, there was this sort of like, the phrase is like, not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination, nor was his family. But the sentiments coming out of his family were things like, oh, he's in a better place, everything happens for a reason, he was in a lot of pain, so it's, so everything happens for a reason. He's up there in the Oilers fan box in the sky, and these kinds of things. And I only bring this up, because it's a weird kind of perhaps religious hangover for those who consider themselves non-religious. Some kinds of general, maybe, and we'll talk about moralistic therapeutic deism in a little bit here as we move a little further into the course. But there does seem to be this kind of hangover set of beliefs, like in an afterlife or in some vision of heaven somehow, or that there's some cosmic force directing everything, that things happen for some kind of reason. Though why this should be the case, as if you don't believe in, say, God or karma or something, especially like a personal force, right? More so than an impersonal force like karma, but a personal force like God or Allah or the Greek gods or whatever it is that floats your boat. Why it should be that everything happens for a reason is absolutely 100% beyond me. It seems like maybe I'm showing my snobbery here as an academic. It seems like a completely indefensible statement, right? And one that simply isn't thought through. Because, why? Why would things happen for a reason? If there, if there is no God, why would it be the case that things happen for a reason? It has never made sense to me. And so when I read things like this, it makes me slightly crazy because I'm like, but why? Why? Well, explain to me why you think everything happens for a reason if there is no thing to give purpose to anything, right? It has never made sense to me. And so when I see this in interview data, I want to hit my head against a wall slightly because it doesn't make sense. So trust in science is really high amongst our nothing in particulars, right? Our non-affiliated folks. Not surprising, right? Science is great, and it's produced wonderful things for the human race, and so they trust in science. A lot of them say science has already has the most of the answers of ultimate concern, which the philosopher side of me, which is a little underdeveloped but still there, suggests that this is just a misapprehension of what we're talking about, in that science this speaks to the imminent, not things of ultimate concern, but whatever. That's perhaps my hang up and my leftover Thomistic sort of framework that I still mostly operate through. So in terms of ultimate concern, morals and values, what's right and wrong. I tend to think these are things that science can answer, but apparently those who are unaffiliated think it can. And certainly, I don't even like atheists like Sam Harris. I think I've sort of tried to make this case. I don't think terribly successfully, but that's an opinion. Yeah, 86% of those who don't believe in God or a universal spirit say they have a strong sense of gratitude or thankfulness. A very healthy attitude. Gratitude or thankfulness, makes you happier. So I'm glad for them. 78% feel a deep sense of wonder about the world, which is, again, I think a really interesting view. Like, they think the world is a wonderful place. And, I tend to agree with that as well. Probably feeling a deep sense of awe about the world is probably a healthy one as well. 67%, also 2/3 think about the meaning of life, which again is I think an interestingly healthy thing, right? Thinking about why are we here? What are we supposed to do with our lives? Good things to think about. So in this sense, right, they're not that different from religious people in a lot of ways. 63% think about what happens after death, which again is interesting, right? So this, I guess, maybe the terror management side of religion, the existential dread of not being potentially, still kind of sits there, and I mean it's a pretty universal human inclination, so I don't think we should be surprised at that. So in terms of values, right, when we talk about our unaffiliated folks, right, humanism, right, and morality are good sources of guidance, right? they think of religion as a source of values, right? People can get their values from religion rather than the only source of values, right? So they see values as non contiguous with religion, right? You can get values from other places. Yeah, and I mean, not surprisingly, right? Among those who reject religion, 95% say it's not necessary to go to church to be a good person. And 91% don't think you need to believe in God to be a good person. And I don't think, I think even most religious people, I don't have the religiously affiliated part of the sample for this, but I think most religiously affiliated people would probably agree with this, especially in kind of late modernity where we encounter, good people who don't necessarily share our values in all sorts of spheres. I think most people would agree that you don't need to be X, Y, Z, but that's more of an assumption on my part. The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A good rule to live by, either in personal relationships or through the state, right? And there is a big focus in the non-affiliated on state action, right? They really do believe that the state is a good place for a lot of this kind of stuff to happen. Why? Because, the state can provide services and such that individuals can't. So, I mean, they tend to be more on the political left. And, contiguous with that, they shared these values that the state should be doing a lot of things for people. So the golden rule is like, well, I'll pay my taxes and the state can deliver, onto others as I would like it delivered on to me. Okay, so we have got 5 subtypes of the nones, and we'll look at them here very quickly. We've got our involved secular, right? So people who participate in atheist or humanist organizations. So these are people actively, typically atheists, who are participating in something. Some atheist groups have done things like Sunday morning gatherings for atheists to kind of simulate what church does, something like that, or other humanist organizations. Inactive non-believers, right? No belief in God or a higher power, slightly or not at all spiritual, and they're just not really doing anything. And this is our biggest group right here. Inactive believers, they believe in God, they attend religious services less than monthly, and they're slightly or not at all spiritual. Pretty self-evident. Spiritual but not religious, self-describe as moderately or very spiritual, and attend religious services infrequently. And then involved believers, why the hell are these in the nones? I don't ever know, but they believe in God or a higher power and attend religious services once a month or more. I mean, these might be nones that are miscategorizing themselves as nones, right? Because they're like, well, I don't have a religion, right? And you find this in some Christian fundamentalist groups or Christian. And yeah, they're like, I don't have a religion, right? I have a relationship with Jesus or something, right? You hear this sometimes, and it's a little perplexing, but it sort of makes sense. Okay, so yeah, this Angus Reid poll, total population 3,000 from 2015. 39% of Canadians refer to themselves as spiritual but not religious. So that's, interesting. 41% of those with no religious affiliation. So that's interesting as well. And 18% of those who say they are religious said they were spiritual but not religious. Okay, so that's a little confusing. Okay, so we got 2 graphs here, just to show kind of the breakdown of what has changed over time with the nones. And I mean, we see basically, on this first chart, right, on the left-hand side, a little bit of growth for our non-believers, right, non-involved and inactive, right? So, they've grown a little bit. Inactive believers have shrunk a little bit. Spiritual but not religious, it kind of grows in fits and starts, had a big kind of growth after 2006, and then another kind of set of growth from about 2008, and then it's kind of been steady from there. Involved believers remain relatively small, but have had a little bit of growth. In terms of our age cohorts, I mean, what's kind of interesting here is, when we get into the youngest cohort, we have more of a percentage than the other cohorts, except for the 65 and older, of our non-spiritual non-believers, right? It's 6% higher in 18 to 34 than 35 to 49. Everything else sort of is in range, other than spiritual but not religious, kind of a big jump. It's not as prevalent. It has a little bit of a loss for our 18 to 34-year-olds. But I think everything else is sort of pretty consistent. Inactive believers, pretty consistent. It's down a little bit in our youngest cohort from its highest point in our 50 to 64-year-olds. But I think all of it suggests there's a fair bit of consistency across generations, although a little bit of growth in that non-spiritual, non-believer among just our nuns. All right, well, that's all I've got on the nuns here. So, lots of interesting things, I think, to say. Sarah and Joel Thiessen, Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme and Joel Thiessen, have kind of given us, I think, lots to think about in terms of who the nuns are and what they believe. And all right, we will go forward from there.